Black man faces racism at restaurant. Waiter's excuse will shock you. A sudden hush fell over the busy dining room the moment Reed walked in. It was subtle, just a soft lull in the conversation, as patrons turned to regard the tall, broad-shouldered black man standing in the doorway. Yet that fleeting moment of near silence struck him like thunder. He felt it reverberate in his chest, as though the air itself carried a warning. Years of life experiences had attuned him to the unspoken tension of rooms like this, a sense that some invisible boundary had been crossed. Determined not to show any trepidation, he squared his shoulders and took a breath, reminding himself he had every right to be there. The hush receded, the clatter of cutlery resumed, and the swirl of chatter wrapped the restaurant in its usual warmth. But something about this place already felt off, even before he'd had the chance to sit down. He was here to celebrate. After months of tireless research, writing, and editing, his first novel had been picked up by a small publishing house. Though modest in scale, the contract was everything he'd dreamed of, an opportunity to see his words in print, to reach readers he might never otherwise encounter. His agent had suggested meeting for a congratulatory dinner at a restaurant rumored to be the best in town. It was famed for its creative fusion dishes and artisan desserts, a chic spot perfect for a small-scale celebration. Hadn't questioned the choice. He loved good food, and more than that, he was ready to break bread in an atmosphere of excitement. He wanted to share the news with his mother, father, and sister, and tonight he was going to do just that. As soon as he entered, he spotted his agent, Stone, waving him over from a table near the large bay window. A petite woman with short, stylishly cropped hair had a brilliant smile that radiated genuine enthusiasm. She was chatting with Sister, who was animatedly recounting some funny anecdote from her day. Their laughter was the perfect soundtrack to a night hoped would be memorable for all the right reasons. He waved in return and navigated through the close-set tables, careful not to bump into the busy wait staff weaving in and out of the narrow aisles. Everything about the restaurant was sleek, from the polished concrete floors to the tastefully arranged wall art that featured vibrant splashes of color. Stylish patrons filled nearly every chair, sipping craft cocktails and devouring lavish plates that smelled divine. He noticed families, couples on dates, and even a few business folks negotiating deals over marbled steaks. It was a modern space that seemed to invite its guests to relax and enjoy themselves, yet couldn't shake the feeling of that earlier hush. It lingered in the back of his mind, raising a cautionary flag. He pushed the feeling aside. He had no intention of letting a quick silence ruin the night, stood up, grinning, and beckoned him closer. "Over here," she called, her excitement so palpable that a few diners glanced up, half smiling at her exuberance. His mother, Judith, and father, Tyrone, were seated across from, and they turned to greet with warm smiles. His mother's eyes shone with pride as he pulled up a seat next to her. She patted his hand fondly, the way she had since he was a boy, and her touch never failed to steady him. His father nodded, a small grin hinting at how proud he was, though Tyrone Reed was a man of few words. His father's nods and fleeting smiles often said more than any sentence could. Leaned forward and clapped her hands together. "Now that the guest of honor is here, maybe the waiter will finally come by for our order," teased, rolling her eyes playfully. "We've been waiting ages. I think they forgot we exist." Glanced around and saw that, indeed, not a single server had approached their table in a while. Shrugged good-naturedly. "It's busy," she said, justifying the delay, though an undertone of frustration peppered her words. "But they saw me wave. I'm sure someone will come soon." Nodded, settling into his seat. He loosened the top button of his shirt, feeling the slightest perspiration at the back of his neck. After all, it was a warm summer night, and he was used to sweltering days that rolled into muggy evenings. He pressed the napkin into his lap, took in a deep breath, and allowed himself a moment to be proud. This was a milestone. His dream was coming true. He began to recount his day, telling them how he'd broken the news to a few of his close friends. Listened with bright eyes, typed away occasionally on her phone, presumably answering emails or social media congratulatory messages. Judith and Tyrone took it all in quietly, smiles unfaltering. They were so proud, and that knowledge glowed in his chest like an ember of confidence. Several minutes drifted by, and still no one came to offer them menus or water. They were chatting so intently that it didn't seem pressing, at least not at first. But after another 10 minutes, stomach rumbled softly. He glanced around, noticing a few waiters who seemed to avoid eye contact with their table, hurriedly passing by as though they were on urgent tasks. He tried to catch someone's eye, raising his hand slightly, but each time, the server would pivot away or tuck themselves behind another table, never meeting his gaze. "That's weird," muttered. "They're ignoring us, right?" Oleg gave her a small, half-hearted laugh. "I'll try to flag someone down," she offered, turning in her seat to wave politely at a tall young waiter who was placing coffee cups at a nearby table. He looked at her for the briefest flicker of a second, nodded as though acknowledging, and then moved away without approaching. Now, it was more than just odd, it felt deliberate. Felt a prickle of annoyance stirring in his gut, and he thought again about that hush which greeted him upon entry. He closed his eyes for a second, willing himself to keep an open mind. Maybe the restaurant was overwhelmed. Maybe they were short-staffed, no sense in jumping to conclusions, but tapped her foot impatiently under the table, and his mother's expression had changed from proud warmth to mild confusion. Tyrone pressed his lips together in silent observation. Finally, a few more minutes later, a server approached. He was middle-aged, tall, and slender, with a thin. He carried himself with a kind of rigid posture that suggested he was not at all interested in pleasantries. He didn't smile when he addressed them. In fact, he cleared his throat before even speaking, as though he were about to make an announcement no one wanted to hear. "Hello," he said briskly. "I'm your waiter for this evening. What can I get you started with?" There was no apology for the long wait, no mention of the delay. He just looked down at them expectantly, pen in hand. An air of impatience clung to his voice. Maintaining her courteous smile, asked, "Could we first get some water, and maybe a moment to look at the menu?" His eyes flicked over his mother, father, sister, and then finally settled on. There was an odd, fleeting expression in the man's gaze, like disapproval or perhaps something more hostile, stiffened under the intensity of that stare. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to make his heart clench. Gave a curt nod. "I'll bring water," he said, his tone tight. "Menus are already on the table." With that, he turned abruptly and walked away, leaving them stunned. Did he think we didn't notice that he never brought any menus? Asked aloud, scanning the tabletop. Indeed, there were no menus here. Seriously, where are they? Pressed his lips into a thin line. This was more than a fluke. He gently patted his arm, trying to calm her, though he could feel her frustration, and it mirrored the tension building in him. "It's fine," he murmured, though he didn't entirely believe it. "We'll just get the menus when he brings water." The group attempted to ease the discomfort by chatting about lighter topics. His job at a local marketing firm, his unstoppable love for historical romance novels, and his parents' hopes for how his publication might open doors for more opportunities. The conversation flowed, but that undercurrent of awkwardness stayed. Each minute that passed without water, without menus, chipped away at the hopeful atmosphere they'd brought with them. Another 20 minutes slipped by. The background hum of the restaurant seemed louder now, droning in his ears like an insistent warning. A wave of embarrassment threatened to wash over him. This was supposed to be a celebration. He was trying to make a good impression with, trying to let his parents and sister share in his triumph. Instead, they were stuck at a table with no service, no refreshments, feeling more and more unwelcome by the minute. He was about to stand up to intercept one of the servers when reappeared, empty-handed, and made direct eye contact with, deliberately ignoring the rest of the table. "We're running out of clean glasses," he said bluntly, as though it explained everything. "I'll get your water as soon as possible, but in the meantime, you should order or you'll risk a longer wait." His eyes narrowed. "You said you were bringing water almost half an hour ago," she pointed out, frustration seeping into her voice. Didn't even look at her. "We're short on staff tonight," he said, refusing to take any blame. "We have limited seating and high demand. You'll need to be patient." The coldness in his tone was striking. Felt a simmer of anger begin to boil in his gut. He had worked in hospitality during his college years, so he knew how demanding it could be. But this was far beyond mere busyness or short staffing. This was targeted, and he had a sinking suspicion about why. "Could we please get menus?" asked, struggling to keep his voice calm and respectful. "We'd like to order, but we haven't even seen what's on offer." Paused, tapping his pen against his notepad. He seemed to think about it for a moment, then relented. "Sure," he muttered, turning on his heel. Moments later, he returned with 4 menus, tossing them onto the table as though he were dealing cards, some of them landing partially folded, edges crumpled. His father finally spoke. "Could we have a 5th menu?" "There are 5 of us here," His voice was calm but firm. His expression soured further, and he sighed heavily as if this request was a major inconvenience. He pulled out another menu from beneath his apron, tossed it onto the table without a word, and pivoted away, heading back to the kitchen. That was the exact moment the table next to them erupted in laughter, and caught a glimpse of two men and a woman glancing over, an air of pity in their expressions. They had obviously witnessed the interaction and were perplexed by the server's behavior, yet they went right back to sipping their wine and finishing their dinner, as if they'd prefer not to get involved. The tension around's table was palpable. Judith frowned at the rumpled menus, picking hers up and smoothing it out carefully. Tyrone inhaled deeply, clasping his hands together on the table, started flipping through the menu, her eyes scanning but not really registering the words. Let out a slow exhale, glancing at, who appeared equally stunned. "I'll remember this place," mumbled. "Not a good first impression." Cleared her throat gently, trying to remain the optimistic voice of reason. Let's look at the menu, find something we like, and then order. Maybe we can salvage the evening. They might just be having a rough night." But as studied the text, the frustration in his chest refused to subside. His thoughts drifted to past experiences, moments in predominantly white neighborhoods where he'd walked into a room or stepped onto a bus and felt that same hush, that same unspoken hostility. No matter how often he told himself to be prepared for it, each incident stung like a new wound. This was supposed to be a night of joy, of celebration. He wanted to set all negative associations aside. He wasn't here to wage a battle. He was here to rejoice in his success. Yet, as the minutes dragged on, it seemed more and more likely that a battle was exactly what he was going to face. The tension wasn't imaginary, not something conjured by paranoia. It was real, tangible, and it was growing. They finally decided on their orders. Wanted the restaurant's famous charred octopus appetizer. Opted for a pasta dish rumored to be topped with a decadent truffle cream sauce. His parents shared a mutual preference for steak, while himself was intrigued by the special of the day, some sort of braised short ribs with seasonal vegetables. After they decided, they closed their menus and waited and waited. 5 more minutes, 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes. The hungry ache in stomach turned into annoying emptiness, but he was more concerned about his mother's pinched expression and the tension in his sister's body language. This was humiliating, and more than that, it was infuriating. At last, stood up, tried to grab his arm, but he gently slipped free. "I need to talk to someone," he told her. "We've waited long enough." "This is ridiculous." He approached the service station near the kitchen, where he saw busying himself with a stack of dirty plates. A young hostess was standing by, tapping on an iPad, presumably updating reservations. Cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me," he said, addressing them both. The hostess looked up, startled, as though she hadn't realized he was there, turned slightly, arms still laden with plates. Neither of them smiled. "My table has been waiting quite a while," explained, keeping his voice composed. "We'd like to place our order, and we still haven't received any water. Is there someone I can speak to about this delay?" The hostess blinked, exchanging a nervous glance with. I'm not sure," she stammered. "The manager is busy in the back. Maybe I can find someone for you." Hoisted the plates up higher in his arms and sneered. "Why don't you sit down and wait your turn?" His voice was low and hostile, meant just for ears. "We're understaffed. We'll get to you when we can." Tried to keep calm, but the blatant disrespect made his jaw clench. "I understand that you might be busy," he said, his voice almost shaking with carefully contained anger. "But we've been waiting for close to an hour, and others who arrived after us have already received their drinks and appetizers." His lips curled into a sneer. "Life isn't always fair," he said, turning to walk away. "Deal with it." Shock and anger warred in his chest. He reached out, carefully placing a hand on shoulder to stop him, not to get physical, but to demand the respect any paying customer deserved. Whipped around violently, nearly knocking the plates out of his own hands, raised his palms in surrender. "I'm not trying to start anything. I just want to speak to a manager." His eyes narrowed and his voice turned cold. "Don't lay your hands on me," he hissed. "Where do you think you are? You don't get to come in here and push people around." The hostess looked alarmed, stepping closer, eyes wide. She looked between and, uncertain of how to de-escalate, saw a few other staff members glancing over with expressions of confusion and mild concern, felt his heart pounding. The last thing he wanted was a scene, but this was too much. "I'm just asking for your manager," he repeated, voice tight. "I'd like to resolve this situation." The hostess swallowed, turning to. I'll get Pierre," she said quietly, referencing the manager. She hurried off to the back, leaving and locked in a silent standoff, lowered the plates onto a side table, folded his arms across his chest, and stared at. "You think you're something special, huh?" he asked, voice dripping with condescension. "Walking in here, throwing money around, expecting everyone to bow and scrape." Blinked, "I just want my family to be served, that's all." Oleg let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "Sure, sure, I've seen your type before, buddy. Strolling in where you're not wanted, demanding the best seat in the house, expecting first-class treatment. That's not how it works here." Oleg's cheeks burned, the subtext was crystal clear. "I'm sorry, my type. Are you going to elaborate on that?" His eyes flashed with a brief flicker of malice, but then he glanced around, noticing that more staff members and a few curious diners were watching the exchange. He pressed his lips together, as though carefully choosing his next words. At that moment, a short, round-cheeked man with a receding hairline appeared, presumably Pierre, the manager. He placed a gentle hand on shoulder, urging him to step aside, then turned to with a placating smile. "Sir, I'm Pierre, the manager. What seems to be the problem?" Retreated, glaring at over Pierre's shoulder. Inhaled slowly, trying to present the facts calmly. "My family and I have been waiting nearly an hour. We haven't received water, and we've asked repeatedly. We'd like to place our food order. We've been ignored. We feel singled out, and this server," he gestured toward, "has been remarkably rude." Pierre nodded, glancing over at. "Let me help resolve this," he said, walking a few steps away from the service station and beckoning to follow. In a hushed tone, Pierre apologized. "I'm very sorry you've had a negative experience tonight. We're short-staffed." Shook his head. "That can't fully explain his behavior. We've watched other tables receive service, some of whom arrived after us." Pierre pursed his lips, his eyes flicking nervously around, as though he wanted to avoid trouble. "Let me see what I can do," he offered. "I'll personally take your order and ensure you get served promptly, and we'll certainly address the behavior with our staff." For a moment, wanted to feel reassured, but he was already on edge. He didn't want to cause a scene, though. The last thing he wanted was to ruin everyone's night. "I appreciate that," he finally said, voice taut. "I really do. My family is seated by the window." Pierre inclined his head. "Go on back, and I'll join you with water and bread." "On the house, of course." Gave him a nod and returned to the table. His family and looked at him with questioning eyes, concern etched across their faces. Muttered, "You were gone for a while. Everything okay?" Oleg managed a small, strained smile. "The manager is handling it," he said, keeping his voice low. "We'll get water and bread soon, and hopefully we can order and enjoy the night." Let out a slow sigh of relief. "Thank goodness," she murmured. "I was starting to think we'd have to leave." "That's still an option if this doesn't get better," Tyrone said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of protective caution. Met his father's eyes and saw the worry there, masked behind calm composure. He admired his father's self-restraint and share of wisdom, but also felt that quiet, unwavering strength that said, "We stand together. Nobody disrespects this family." Several minutes later, Pierre appeared, carrying a tray with 6 glasses of water, one extra, perhaps as an olive branch, and a basket of warm bread with small cups of butter. He set them down gently, apologizing once more. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said, the corners of his mouth curved into a practiced smile. "What can I get everyone to eat tonight? I'll make sure you're well taken care of." Anne's parents gave him their orders, grateful that Pierre was at least being polite. Requested the braised short ribs. The manager jotted everything down. "Everything looks good," he said, double-checking. "I'll expedite these orders. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to wave me over." His tone was warm, if a little forced, and with that, he departed. Noticed lurking a few tables away, collecting plates and side-eyeing them with a grim expression, but at least it seemed he wouldn't be directly involved in their service anymore. For a while, the tension at the table relaxed slightly. They sipped their water, tried the bread, crusty and fresh from the oven, and chatted about lighter topics. His parents asked about the distribution plan for his upcoming book. Teased, reminding him that as soon as he got famous, he owed her the courtesy of a front-row seat at any book events he held. Even so, felt the occasional ripple of unease. A couple seated one table away stared at them a little too often, though they quickly turned away when caught. The restaurant buzzed, but there was still that intangible sense of them being out of place, of them being watched. Food arrived in a timely manner, delivered by Pierre himself. The plates looked and smelled delicious, steak cooked to glistening perfection, pasta with creamy truffle sauce that made mouth water, a charred octopus that praised as exquisite, and braised short ribs that had a tempting aroma of slow-cooked meat and fresh herbs. Finally, some good news, quipped, leaning over to catch a whiff of her father's steak. I'm starving. They dug in, trying to salvage the night. For a few minutes, the conversation revolved around the flavors, each dish's texture and taste, the of the restaurant if one ignored the earlier fiasco. The food was indeed top-notch, which made it all the more maddening that the service had been so abysmal. Found his eyes wandering the room. The space was elegantly lit, with overhead fixtures that cast warm, golden light across the tables. There were flashes of bright color from the modern art on the walls. Waiters gilded between guests, smiling and chatting, refilling glasses of wine. He noticed how they lingered at certain tables, engaged in friendly banter, inquiring about the meal, yet not once did anyone approach to ask how his family's dinner was going. Pierre was nowhere to be seen, presumably handling multiple tables, but it still felt like they were outliers. Invisible, yet simultaneously singled out, tried to steer the conversation back to good news. So after your debut novel, do you have any ideas for a follow-up? She asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. I know it's early, but trust me, publishers will want to know about your pipeline. Nodded. I have a few ideas simmering, maybe something that delves deeper into social issues. He paused, an ironic twist in his smile, thinking about the overt discrimination they'd just faced. Or maybe something more personal, about identity and... He stopped mid-sentence when he realized was hovering near the table again, not to serve or inquire, but just standing there, arms folded. The expression on his face was unreadable, but his presence cast a dark shadow over the otherwise pleasant moment. Noticed him too, furrowing her brow in confusion, cleared his throat loudly. The group paused, forks suspended in midair. Everything all right here? He asked in a slow, mocking drawl. It was a question loaded with sarcasm, not genuine concern. His father placed his utensils down carefully, raising his gaze to meet the waiters. We're fine, Tyrone said, voice cool and level. Is there something you need? Just stared, unblinking, for a long beat. Then he turned on his heel and walked away without another word. Anger sparked again in his chest, but he tamped it down, refusing to let this man ruin the meal. He forced himself to keep eating, trying to focus on the savory tenderness of the short ribs. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his mother's trembling hand as she lifted her fork. She set it down, whispering, I've lost my appetite. Before could respond, leaned over and gently put a hand on Judith's arm. Please, don't let him spoil this. We're here to celebrate your son, she said softly. We've come so far, and I want this night to be a happy memory. Judith let out a small, resigned sigh. I know, she said, schooling her features into a calmer expression, but the tension in her eyes remained. They managed to continue eating, though the mood had shifted yet again. Over the next half hour, they finished their entries, offered bits of her dish around, and shared some of her octopus. The steak was cooked just right, the short ribs succulent, the pasta creamy. It was a small solace in what had become a strange, tension-filled evening. Finally, when their plates were mostly empty, Pierre reappeared. He smiled politely. Would you like to see the dessert menu? We have a lovely tiramisu, or perhaps a chocolate fondant that's very popular. Hesitated, glancing around the table. He could read the exhaustion and frustration on everyone's faces. Still had a sweet tooth, and he suspected she might want dessert. What do you think? He asked. Dessert or no? Shrugged half-heartedly. Tiramisu is my favorite, but after everything, I don't know. Pierre tried to remain upbeat. I can offer something special on the house, he said, obviously recognizing the lingering dissatisfaction. I'd like to make this up to you if that's possible. Pressed her lips together. That's very kind, she said. We could give dessert a try and wrap up the evening. Judith and Tyrone exchanged a glance. They nodded slowly, as if silently agreeing to put up with just a bit more, so nodded too. We'll try the tiramisu and the chocolate fondant, he said. Thank you. Pierre took the dessert order and excused himself. Watched him go, aware that was at another table, collecting dishes. Shoulders tensed, anticipating another unpleasant interaction, but didn't approach them this time. Instead, he shot them one more furtive glare, then disappeared through a door labeled staff only. Oleg exhaled the tension, trying to let it drain from his body. Almost done, he murmured, half to himself. Just dessert, and then we can leave. Offered a small, encouraging smile. We'll just savor dessert, toast to your success, and next time we'll pick a better spot. She forced a light laugh and nodded in agreement. It took about 15 minutes for the desserts to arrive. Pierre served them with an attempt at showmanship, sprinkling cocoa on the tiramisu, drizzling chocolate sauce on the fondant, topping each with a small sprig of mint. The presentation was indeed lovely, and for a brief moment, everyone's spirits lifted. Took a bite of the tiramisu and closed her eyes, savoring it with a soft hum of delight. Despite the sour start, the restaurant truly did serve remarkable food. Tried a forkful of the chocolate fondant. It was rich and decadent, the center oozing chocolate that coated his tongue with sweetness. He leaned back in his chair, letting himself enjoy this small bright spot in the otherwise infuriating night. He looked around the table at his family, his mother, father, sister, and aunt, who'd stuck by him not just as an agent, but as a friend. He felt a surge of love and gratitude for all of them. They were here celebrating him, despite the hostility swirling around them in the form of glaring, the silent stares from some of the other diners. In that moment, he felt fiercely proud of who he was and the people he belonged to. They were about 3/4 through their desserts when a commotion by the entrance caught everyone's attention. The front door swung open, and a small group entered, a family with 2 rambunctious kids, the father a broad-chested black man with a big laugh that resonated across the dining room. Immediately felt the hush descend again. It was less pronounced than when he and his family had arrived, but it was unmistakable. The hostess greeted this new family, but her voice was quiet, her demeanor uncertain. Saw the father's laughter subside a bit as he noticed the shift, and the mother's expression changed from relaxed to wary. Stomach twisted. He recognized that moment, that shift, that tension. He watched as the hostess quickly scanned the nearly full restaurant, looking for a spot to place them. There was a table open near the back, but it was jammed between 2 larger parties. The hostess directed them there, and the father's shoulders sagged slightly. He was probably hoping for a more comfortable table. Forced his attention back to his own table. His face had fallen again. She had noticed the hush, the same hush that greeted them. Fiddled with her spoon, jaw tight. Even Judith and Tyrone exchanged knowing looks. They all understood what was happening, and it cast a shadow over that last bit of sweetness in their desserts. Finally, they finished eating, setting down forks and spoons. Took one last sip of water and glanced at her watch. "I'm ready to go whenever," she murmured. Felt the same. "Let's just get the check," he said, glancing around. Pierre was nowhere to be found. He could see a cluster of servers near the bar, chatting quietly, but none ventured near their table. The universal sign for wanting the bill, closed menus, glances around, even a raised hand, yielded no results. Enough was enough, stood up, crossing the room to the bar area. A younger server turned his head, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, and then quickly looked away, approached anyway. "Excuse me," he said, forcing politeness into his tone. "We'd like to pay and leave." One of the servers, a woman with short hair, nodded in. "Table by the window?" she asked. He nodded. "I'll bring your check," she said, turning to find a computer terminal. Returned to the table. Was already gathering her purse, checking her phone, Tyrone and Judith gently dabbing at their mouths with napkins. The tension in the air was thick, but they were unified in wanting to wrap this up. A couple minutes later, the server brought the bill. She placed it down and managed a small smile. "I'm sorry if tonight wasn't up to our usual standards," she offered quietly, her tone sincere. Then she left, leaving them to inspect the check. Scanned it. The bread and water were comped, as well as the desserts, presumably Pierre's way of apologizing. The drinks, however, were all there. Reached for the check, but gently slid it away from her. "My treat," he said softly. "I insisted on taking you out tonight. Let me pay." She opened her mouth to object, but shook his head, and she relented. He slipped his card into the leather holder and placed it at the edge of the table, waiting for a server to collect it. Of course, no one came. Finally, stood again and walked it over to the bar. As he handed the holder to the server, he caught a glimpse of standing in the far corner. He was speaking to another server, a smug, self-satisfied expression on his face, but he quickly turned away as looked over. Felt an intense desire to confront him, to demand an explanation for why he'd been so blatantly disrespectful. But a mixture of exhaustion and the desire to protect his family from further distress held him back. The server ran the card and handed the slip to sign. He scribbled his signature, added a tip. Though it pained him to tip any establishment that let such behavior slide, he knew the tip might not even be but for the rest of the staff who had not openly antagonized them. He returned to his table, nodding for everyone to gather their belongings. Quietly, they made their way to the exit. It wasn't until they were back on the sidewalk, the cool night air washing over them, that let out a deep breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Wrapped an arm around his waist, leaning against him for a moment of comfort, shook her head in disbelief. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I never would have chosen that place if I'd known." "You had no way of knowing," Judith replied gently, though her expression remained troubled. "You were just trying to pick a nice restaurant." Tyrone placed a hand on shoulder. "We got through it," he said in his calm, steady voice. "Let's not let them ruin what this night was really about." Oleg nodded, swallowing the knot of anger and humiliation. "Right," he said, but it was easier said than done. The sting of the evening's events weighed heavily on him, overshadowing what should have been a joyous occasion. As they parted ways to her car, to hers, parents insisted on giving him a ride home. He accepted gratefully, not wanting to be alone with his churning thoughts just yet. During the drive, his mother turned from the front seat, reaching back to place a comforting hand on his knee. He sat in the back, gazing out the window at the passing city lights, lost in thought. "You know," Judith said softly, "we're so proud of you. None of what happened tonight changes that." Forced a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I'm sorry you had to see that." "Oh, don't apologize," Tyrone interjected firmly, his gaze fixed on the road. "You didn't do anything wrong. That place just wasn't worth our time." Smother nodded in agreement. "You handled yourself well. You tried to address it calmly, to find a solution. That's all you can do." "Sometimes I think I should made a bigger scene," admitted, bitterness creeping into his voice. "That man, the way he acted, it's not okay." His father sighed, the lines around his eyes deepening. "No, it's not, but we live in a world where, unfortunately, some people still carry these hateful attitudes. You stand up for yourself the best you can, but you also choose your battles. Tonight was supposed to be about celebrating your achievement. It's not fair, but this is the reality we deal with." Slumped back against the seat, he hated that his father was right, hated that they had to endure such treatment without recourse. He replayed sneer, the sharpness in his voice, and felt a churn of anger. Yet, as he looked at his parents, his anger softened into a sort of resigned sadness. They'd faced a lifetime of this. He remembered stories his dad told him about workplaces where the managers would schedule him for the worst shifts, or times his mother was followed around in department stores as if she were a potential shoplifter. This was a continuing legacy of discrimination they'd been forced to navigate day in and day out. He said nothing more during the drive. By the time they reached his apartment building, the emotional weight of the evening pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He thanked his parents for the ride, embraced them both, and trudged up the steps to his unit. Inside, he kicked off his shoes and sat at his kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. Tonight was supposed to be joyous. He'd had such high hopes. Though the taste of the meal still lingered on his tongue, all he could truly taste was bitterness. What had started with so much promise was overshadowed by one hateful individual's actions, an entire restaurant's silent collusion, and the knowledge that this was far from an isolated incident. He stayed like that for several minutes, letting the silence of his apartment wash over him. Eventually, he forced himself to get up, flick on the lights, and pour himself a glass of water. He scrolled through his phone, noticing messages from friends congratulating him on his publication deal. One text from Red, "Don't let that creep ruin your night. I love you, big bro." Another from, "Stay strong, don't let them overshadow your big moment." He typed back a brief thank yous, but then his phone buzzed again, an unknown number. Curious, he opened the message. "This is Pierre from the restaurant. I got your number from his business card. Please call me when you can." His brow furrowed. He wondered why on earth the restaurant manager would be reaching out so late. A swirl of emotions spiraled within him, anger, annoyance, but also curiosity. He took a moment to steady himself, then dialed the number. It rang twice before Pierre answered. "Hello," came the hesitant voice on the other end. "This is," he said. "You wanted me to call." Yes, thank you," Pierre said, sounding relieved. Look, I wanted to apologize again for everything that happened tonight, and I need to explain something about. His jaw set. I'm listening, he said carefully, though part of him wanted to hang up. Pierre sighed. He's been with us for a while, but recently he's had some personal issues. He's always been a bit prickly, but tonight was extreme. I suspect it might be related to something else going on in his life, but that doesn't excuse it. I wanted you to know I'm taking disciplinary action. A cold rush of anger washed through. So you're telling me he treated us like that because of some personal issues? That's your excuse, because that's not how it felt. It felt like blatant racism. There was a long pause on the line. I know, Pierre said quietly. Honestly, I'm not sure. He's had a very difficult family situation recently, and it's been affecting his work. Family situation or not, that doesn't justify him acting so hateful, bit out. Short-staffed or not, he was out of line. I agree, Pierre said quickly. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness on his behalf. I'm calling because I wanted you to know we don't condone that, and we're taking steps to make sure it never happens again. We'll be suspended, possibly fired, depending on the outcome of a conversation with our owner. Inhaled slowly, he closed his eyes, rubbing his temples with his free hand. He wasn't sure how to feel. The manager's tone sounded sincere, but it also felt like too little, too late. Well, he said finally, I appreciate you taking it seriously now, but the damage is done. My family's experience tonight was ruined. Pierre's voice was heavy with contrition. I know, and I understand if you never come back. I just wanted to reach out. I feel personally responsible. I should have intervened sooner or recognized the signs. I hope you'll accept our apology, if there's anything I can do. Shook his head even though Pierre couldn't see him. Thank you, but I think it's best we just move on, he said, voice tight. Good luck with your decisions. He ended the call before Pierre could respond. For several moments, sat still, phone clenched in his hand. 1,000 thoughts competed for attention in his mind. Should he be satisfied that the manager was finally taking action? Should he be angry that it took a public confrontation and complaint for them to address it? Could really have been so hateful because of some personal crisis? Or was it simply that he hated seeing a table of black diners enjoying a celebratory evening? Eventually got up and poured himself another glass of water. Sipping it slowly, he turned off the lights and made his way to his bedroom. He lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling fan rotating slowly in the dim light. He felt exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally, yet his mind wouldn't shut off. Images of sneering face, the hush that fell when he first walked in, the glances from other diners, all played through his head on a loop. Sleep came slowly, and it was fitful when it did. He dreamt of being in that restaurant again, only this time it stretched into some warped labyrinth with no exit, the lights flickering on and off, his voice echoing from every corner. Deal with it, deal with it. When morning arrived, woke with a start, tangled in his sheets, sweat dampening his brow. He rolled onto his back and let out a long exhale. Despite the gloom that clung to his mind, a new day beckoned, offering the possibility of better moments. He checked his phone. A message from blinked on the screen. Call me later. I have an idea. Still feeling groggy, he rubbed his eyes and took a quick shower, letting the hot water steady him. Then he settled at his desk, phone in hand, and dialed. She picked up on the first ring. Good morning, she said, her tone brisk and determined. I wanted to talk about last night. Grimaced, I figured I'm still processing it. Sighed on the other end. Me too, I'm furious, but I've also been thinking. Your upcoming novel deals with themes of resilience and belonging, doesn't it? Felt a flicker of curiosity. Yes, it does. Why? I know you haven't started promoting it heavily yet. That's what the publisher's marketing plan is for. But what if you used your personal platform to call out what happened last night? I'm not suggesting a smear campaign, but maybe an honest reflection. You're a writer, after all. You know how to convey emotion and nuance. Oleg leaned back in his chair. You're suggesting I write about it and share it publicly. Yes, said voice firm, not to seek revenge, but to highlight that racism still happens in places you might not expect. And to show how it affects real people, especially during what should be joyous moments. It could resonate with readers who had similar experiences, and it ties into the themes of your book. It's personal, it's real, and it's powerful. Oleg swallowed. I don't want to come off as using this for publicity. I understand, replied gently, but you also have a right to speak up. You can do so in a dignified way that shows your perspective and encourages dialogue. In fact, this is exactly the type of social commentary that your work addresses. Why not let your voice be heard? He stared at the blank document on his laptop screen, the cursor blinking expectantly. A tumult of emotions swirled within him, anger at the injustice, reluctance to relive it, but also a sense of responsibility. He thought about all the times he'd read about similar incidents, someone posting their story online, raising awareness, igniting conversations. Maybe it was time he added his own voice to that chorus. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll try to write something, see how it feels." Let out a relieved breath. "Good, and no matter what you decide, I'll support you." They ended the call and spent the next few hours drafting an article, part personal essay, part open letter. He wrote about the hush that fell when he entered, about sneering hostility, about the sense of humiliation that shadowed the night. He was careful to mention that while the manager eventually apologized, the damage was done. He wrote candidly about how it felt to have a celebration of his personal milestone overshadowed by bigotry. By the time he was done, he'd poured his hurt, anger, and disappointment onto the page. Yet he also ended with a note of hope about how, despite experiences like these, he refused to stop celebrating his victories. About how he would keep writing stories that uplifted marginalized voices, keep fighting for spaces where he and his loved ones could exist joyfully. He shared the piece with, who sent it to his publisher's marketing team. They suggested a few small edits, but overall, they praised the raw authenticity of his voice. Finally, with a slight tremor of anxiety, he posted it on his personal blog and then on social media. It didn't take long for it to garner attention. Comments, shares, messages of solidarity from friends, strangers, other authors, and activists. In the days that followed, he found himself inundated with responses. Some were supportive, empathetic, and outraged on his behalf. Others were dismissive, claiming he was exaggerating or pushing a race card. That was painful to read, but he braced himself. He reminded himself that his experience was valid, that thousands of others had faced similar discrimination, and that speaking out was how real change could start. Eventually, local news outlets picked up the story. It wasn't front-page national news, but a few journalists reached out for interviews. They wanted to talk about racial bias in the service industry, about the challenges people of color face even in supposedly progressive cities. Found the courage to speak to them. He didn't name the restaurant in the sense of urging a boycott, but he shared enough details to make the story credible and highlight the reality of everyday racism. Pierre, the manager, reached out again, leaving voicemails. He apologized once more and asked if he'd consider coming back, offering a free meal or a chance to meet with the owner in person. Never responded. In his heart, he felt that place was tainted by memories of how he and his family had been treated. Apparently, had been fired after an internal review. Some might have said that was justice, but the entire saga left a hollow feeling in his chest. No single firing would erase the culture that allowed such attitudes to flourish. Still, in the midst of all this, his debut novel's pre-order sales began to climb. People who read his article were curious about the author behind the story. They wanted to support him, to champion a voice willing to speak out about painful truths. Called him one afternoon, excitement bubbling in her voice. "We're getting so much traction," she said. "Your publisher wants you on a local radio show next week to discuss your upcoming release, and of course the article." Swallowed, "I don't want to be known just for this," he admitted. "I'm proud of my book, the story it tells. I want people to read it because it's good, not because they feel sorry for me or outraged on my behalf." His tone softened. "I understand," she said. "And you do deserve to be read for your talent. But if this incident brings more eyes to your work, maybe that's a silver lining. People will see your talent and keep supporting you for all the right reasons." He nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I guess you're right," he said softly. The rest of the week passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and social media notifications. Balanced the chaos by grounding himself in writing, starting notes on a second novel, jotting down poems and short scenes whenever the stress of publicity threatened to overwhelm him. The negative comments online weighed on him, but the positive ones reminded him he wasn't alone. He connected with readers who shared their own stories, some heartbreakingly similar. One day, he received a handwritten letter in his mailbox. The return address was from an older couple in a nearby suburb. Inside, They wrote about how reading his story opened their eyes to the subtle forms of racism that they'd never experienced personally. They admitted they'd always assumed these kinds of things don't really happen anymore. His words had changed their perspective. They closed by offering sincere thanks and a promise to do better in challenging ignorance within their own circles. Read that letter twice, tears prickling the corners of his eyes. In that moment, it felt worth it, worth the pain of writing about his trauma and reliving it through interviews. If even one person was moved to change, that was a step forward. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet, the memories of that evening returned. He'd see the entire restaurant freeze for that one moment when he entered. He'd hear sneering voice, deal with it. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many others had endured the same and never spoken out. How many times had he himself let similar slights roll off his back just for the sake of peace? When the local radio appearance date arrived, felt a twinge of anxiety. He'd never done a live interview before. Accompanied him to the station, a modest studio in a drab building downtown. She coached him on how to handle questions, how to pivot back to the novel's themes. He nodded, absorbing her advice with a forced calmness. His stomach fluttered, and his hands were clammy as he waited in the lobby. Soon, a cheerful producer led them into the studio, where the host, a genial man in his 50s, greeted them warmly. The show began, and they chatted about the novel, about its background, about his inspirations. Then, inevitably, the conversation turned to the article he had written. The host asked him to recount the incident at the restaurant, and obliged, voice trembling slightly when he recalled the hush that greeted him, the scorn on his face. "How did this experience change you?" the host asked softly, paused. He remembered his father's quiet strength, his mother's trembling hand, sense of anger's protective concern. "It reminded me that no matter how far I think I've come, there are still people who will judge me by the color of my skin before they hear a single word from my mouth," he said. "But it also reminded me of the power of speaking up. My family and friends stood by me, and when I shared my story, countless people offered support. Some might say I'm stirring the pot, but all I did was tell the truth. Sharing the truth can open eyes, spark conversations, and that's how change begins." The host nodded sympathetically, and they went to a commercial break, gave him a thumbs up from where she stood behind the glass. He exhaled in relief, feeling the tension in his shoulders lessen. This was who he was, a man who wrote stories, who believed in the power of empathy and dialogue, but also wouldn't stay silent in the face of injustice. When the show ended, the host thanked him for his courage, for bringing awareness to something many people prefer to ignore. Left the studio feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He knew the fight against bigotry was far from over, but he also felt a sense of purpose. If his words could make even a small dent in someone's ignorance, if his art could inspire compassion and reflection, then maybe he was on the right path. In the weeks that followed, began receiving invitations to panels and literary events, some of which specifically wanted him to discuss racial justice themes. He was still uneasy about being seen as an activist author, rather than just an author, but he realized that, in some ways, his identity and his experiences were unavoidably part of his art. Every word he wrote came from who he was, shaped by his history and environment. Amid the swirl of publicity, the memory of that night in the restaurant never lost its sting, but it also became part of the tapestry of his personal journey. He'd joke with sometimes, saying, "Remember when the only thing we wanted was a nice dinner?" And she'd roll her eyes, feigning exasperation. But beneath that, they both knew how painful that night was and how it had forced them, yet again, to confront an ugly truth about the world they lived in. Months passed, his novel launched to solid reviews. Sales were respectable, and while it wasn't a breakout bestseller, it made a noticeable splash in the literary world. Critics praised its heartfelt storytelling and thoughtful examination of identity and belonging. Found himself balancing the responsibilities of a debut author, book signings, interviews, social media engagement, with the complexities of his newfound platform. He was no longer just Reed, an aspiring novelist. He was Reed, the author who'd spoken out about racism, whose personal experiences fueled real conversations about prejudice. One afternoon, while responding to reader emails, a message caught his eye. It was from someone who claimed to be his cousin. The email read, "Hello. You don't know me, but I'm related to the waiter who disrespected you at the restaurant months ago. I wanted to apologize for his behavior. He's been going through a hard time. His wife was diagnosed with cancer, and they'd racked up medical bills. It made him bitter and angry at the world, but that's no excuse for his racism. We, as his family, have been trying to get him help, and I wanted you to know he regrets what happened. He lost his job, but maybe that was a wake-up call. I read your book. It opened my eyes to how people can be blind to the pain they cause. I'm not sure how you feel about hearing this, but I wanted to reach out, to say I'm sorry on his behalf, and to thank you for sharing your story. Stared at the screen for a long time. The swirl of emotions threatened to overwhelm him: sympathy for his wife, anger at the rationalization of his racism, confusion about whether he could ever truly forgive. In the end, he typed a careful response. Thank you for sharing this. I'm sorry for what your family is going through, and I hope your cousin gets the help he needs. I can't speak to what he feels or how he'll change, but I appreciate you acknowledging the harm done. I wish you and your family well. He hit send, feeling a strange sense of finality, as though he were closing a chapter on that painful night. Maybe truly did regret it. Maybe he was just remorseful because he lost his job. Didn't know, and perhaps it didn't matter. What mattered was that had chosen to speak out, had chosen to stand firm in his sense of dignity, and had found the courage to transform a hateful encounter into a catalyst for dialogue and awareness. A few days later, visited him. She insisted on taking him out to celebrate once more, this time to a new, vibrant soul food restaurant downtown known for its warm hospitality. Hesitated, but she just grinned and took his hand. Come on, she teased. You deserve a good meal in a place that welcomes us. Let's rewrite the memory. They arrived to an atmosphere of boisterous laughter, jazz music playing softly in the background, the scent of fried chicken and baked macaroni and cheese tantalizing their senses. The hostess, a black woman with a bright smile, welcomed them with genuine warmth. They were seated without delay, given menus, and served cold glasses of water within minutes. It felt like a different world. No hush fell, no curious stares, just normalcy. As they dug into plates of delicious food, fried catfish for smothered pork chops for said, "This is how it should be. This is how it can be." Nodded, savoring the moment. He thought about how the littlest gestures, a friendly smile, prompt service, genuine hospitality, could stand in stark contrast to hostility. The difference was staggering, and it highlighted just how deeply the memory of that other restaurant had wounded him. They chatted about everyday life, about upcoming projects at work, about progress on his second novel. Gradually, the conversation shifted to that fateful night, but this time with a note of triumph. You turned it into something meaningful, said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. That's what you do. You take difficult experiences and shape them into stories that make people think. His gaze dropped to the table for a moment, a warm flutter of gratitude spreading through him. I'm trying, he said. It's not always easy, but I'm trying. He looked around the restaurant at the bustling crowd, families, couples, friends, all different races and backgrounds from what he could see. Laughter mingled with the clink of dishes, and the music carried a lively, welcoming rhythm. This was a tapestry of life that made him feel part of a bigger family, a human family that, at its best, embraced diversity and kindness. Later that night, when returned home, he felt lighter. The ghost of that previous restaurant encounter still lingered in his memories, but it no longer held him hostage. He'd reclaimed his narrative. He'd taken the bitterness and used it to fuel conversation, to deepen his writing, to reach readers who needed to hear his story. And in doing so, he proved to himself, and perhaps to the world, that no matter how deep the wounds of discrimination cut, they could not silence him. He stood at his desk, looking at the typed manuscript pages of his second novel, still in progress. He lifted the top page and scanned a few lines, reading words he'd written days before. We rise from the ashes of our pain, forging resilience out of adversity, building a life that demands respect. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Outside, the city lights glimmered, each one a reminder that countless lives in the darkness, each with its own story, struggles, and triumphs. Inhaled, placed the pages back down, and sat, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. He began to type, the quiet clack of the keys filling his apartment. He wrote with renewed purpose, determined to turn every hint of pain into a voice that demanded to be heard, a story that insisted on hope. He typed long into the night, buoyed by the knowledge that what had once been a moment of deeply personal humiliation had become a catalyst for empathy and reflection, not just for him, but for others too. Through every line, he reaffirmed the same unshakable truth. He was here to celebrate life, to celebrate art, and no hateful glance or biting word could stop him from creating stories that resonated with the deepest part of the human spirit. And in that pursuit, he found that he had already won.